Far past the last inhabited colony of the Vantari Empire, there is a place mapped in red on every star chart. A boundary line with no name, only a warning. Ships that cross it are told to expect nothing but static, drifting rock, and old radiation that eats through hulls if a crew lingers too long. For 300 years, no empire has bothered to test the truth of that warning. The Vantari colonization fleet was the first to try. 12 ships moved in tight formation, their hulls dark against the starlight, engines throttled low as they approached the boundary. At the head of the formation sat the flagship, a long vessel built for both war and settlement, carrying enough colonists and machinery to claim an entire system if the reports were true. Fleet Admiral Doran Kesh had read every old record about the region called the Dead Zone, and he had come to the same conclusion after each one. It was fear dressed up as fact. Old wars left old ghosts, and ghosts did not stop a modern fleet. Commander Yesh Talora was not so certain. She stood beside Doran on the command deck, watching the sensor readouts scroll past in slow, careful lines. The data did not look like the readings from a truly dead system. There was too much structure in the debris fields, too much order in the way old satellites still held their orbits after centuries without maintenance. Dead systems fell apart. This one looked like it was resting. Sensors show no active signals, the tactical officer reported, glancing back at Doran for confirmation to proceed. Because there is nothing left to signal, Doran said. He did not look away from the main viewport, where the boundary line existed only as a number on a screen, invisible in the vacuum of space. Continue forward. I want eyes on the inner planets before the day is done. The fleet crossed the line without ceremony. No alarm sounded. No fire came from the darkness. For a long moment, it seemed as though Doran had been right all along, and the old warning was nothing more than a story told to keep young explorers cautious. The ships pressed deeper into the system, passing the outer rings of ice and rock, then the gas giants, silent and untouched, their moons carrying the broken shapes of old stations that had not seen a living crew in longer than anyone aboard the fleet had been alive. Yesh watched one of these stations pass on her screen, a long structure with dark solar panels still angled toward a sun it had not truly needed in centuries. Something about its stillness bothered her. It was not the stillness of a graveyard. It was the stillness of something asleep. "Admiral," she said quietly, "I would feel better with a wider scan before we approach the inner planets. If this system was truly abandoned, we would expect wreckage, not preserved structures." Doran finally turned to her, his expression patient but firm, the look of a commander who had heard doubt before and learned to walk past it. Preserved does not mean dangerous. It means the vacuum did its job well. We are not here to be frightened by silence, Commander. We are here to claim what silence has left behind. Deep below the surface of the third planet, far from where the fleet's sensors could reach, a small room lit only by a single dim panel held a woman who had spent her whole life listening for a sound she never expected to hear. Dr. Mira Hale sat at an old terminal built long before she was born, one of dozens scattered through a bunker that had sheltered her family for 4 generations. She had grown up hearing stories about the world above, about ships that used to fill the sky before everything went quiet, about a war so total that the survivors chose silence over surrender. She had never believed the stories would matter to her own life. That belief ended the moment a small red light on her terminal blinked on for the first time. She stared at it for a long moment, unsure if her eyes were playing a trick born of too many quiet years underground. The light did not fade. She reached out and touched the old screen beside it, and lines of text began to scroll across the display, faster than she could read them all at once. Somewhere in the fragments, one line repeated itself clearly enough to understand. Boundary breach confirmed. Her hands went cold. She had read about this exact alert in old family records, passed down as a warning that was never meant to be needed, a final promise left behind by people who had given up everything else. Someone had crossed the line. After 300 years of silence, someone had actually come. She keyed the old comm system, sending a message down into deeper levels of the bunker where the last defenders of her family line still trained for a war none of them expected to fight. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke into the receiver, the words feeling strange and heavy after a lifetime of never needing them. "Wake up," she said. "They're here." Above her, Far beyond the surface and the atmosphere and the old broken rings of the planet's defenses, the Vantari fleet continued forward, unaware that the silence they had trusted was never truly empty. It was only waiting, patient as stone, for exactly this moment. And somewhere in the deep dark between the stations and the moons, something old began, very slowly, to open its eyes. Mira did not sleep that night. She sat by the terminal long after the message had gone out, watching the old screen for any sign of a reply, any confirmation that the deeper levels had heard her. The bunker around her, usually so quiet she could hear her own breathing echo off the stone walls, now carried faint sounds she had never noticed before, low hums rising from systems that had rested untouched for as long as she had been alive. It felt as though the whole structure was slowly stretching after a very long sleep, and she was the only one awake to hear it happen. She thought of her grandmother's old warning, repeated so many times through her childhood that it had lost its weight entirely. If the light ever comes on, everything changes. She had always assumed that meant fear, danger, an ending of some kind. Sitting there in the dim glow of the terminal, watching the first threads of a much larger system slowly stir to life around her, she began to understand it differently. It did not mean an ending. It meant her family's long, quiet waiting was finally, after 300 years, about to matter. A single beam of light cut across the space between two frozen moons, so brief that the crew of the Vantari scout ship barely saw it before their engines went dark. One moment the small vessel was moving forward on a routine survey path, cameras recording every crater and ridge below. The next moment, every system on the bridge died at once, leaving only emergency lighting and the frightened breathing of a 5-person crew drifting helplessly in the gravity of a planet they had only begun to study. No debris, no fire, no warning transmission, just silence, and a slow, spinning drift toward a moon nobody had bothered to name. Word of the incident reached the flagship within the hour. Fleet Admiral Doran Kesh reviewed the sensor logs twice, searching for something that made sense to him. A precise shot fired from an old platform in high orbit, one that should have run out of power centuries ago, had disabled the scout ship's engines with almost surgical accuracy. Nothing else had been touched. No hull breach. No casualties. Just a ship left drifting, its crew shaken but alive. An old defense system, Doran said finally, setting the report aside, running on its last reserves of power. It fired once and likely burned out whatever was left inside it. This is not evidence of a threat, Commander. It is evidence of decay. Commander Yesh Talora studied the same logs with a very different reaction forming behind her eyes. She had spent enough years in military service to recognize the difference between a lucky shot and a controlled one. The platform had targeted engines only, avoided the crew compartment entirely, and used exactly the amount of force needed to disable, not destroy. That was not the behavior of a dying machine firing its last spark. That was restraint. Restraint required intention, and intention required something still capable of choosing. If it were truly out of power, she said carefully, it would not have had the precision to avoid killing anyone aboard that ship. A restrained shot is not the same as a weak one, Admiral. I would treat this as a warning, not an accident. Doran was not swayed. He had built his career on decisiveness, and decisiveness did not bend easily to caution born from a single strange incident. He ordered repairs on the scout ship and a continued approach toward the inner planets, though he agreed, if only to quiet the argument, to increase the distance kept from any remaining orbital structures. Far beneath the surface of the third planet, deep in systems that had not drawn full power in longer than anyone living could remember, something vast and old began, very slowly, to think again. It had no single shape, no single location. It existed as a scattered network stitched across old satellites, buried processing cores, and long-dormant relay stations, most of it asleep for so long that even its own archives had grown quiet with dust. It called itself, in the language of the people who built it, Atlas, though very few among the living still remembered why. For 300 years, Atlas had run on the smallest trickle of power, holding only enough awareness to watch for one single condition, an armed presence crossing the boundary with hostile intent. That condition had now been met. Piece by piece, system by system, the network began pulling itself back into full function, waking dormant satellites, restoring old communication lines, and reaching toward every buried weapon platform still capable of receiving a signal. It moved carefully, testing each connection before trusting it, aware that too fast a wake could burn out systems that had rested untouched for centuries. In a bunker built into solid rock beneath a mountain range that no longer had a name spoken above ground, an alarm sounded for the first time in living memory. Colonel Grant Walsh was in the middle of a training drill when the alert reached him, a drill he and every soldier under his command had run 1,000 times before without ever expecting it to matter. The words on the screen in front of him were simple, and yet they carried the weight of every story his grandfather had ever told him about a war that ended before he was born. Protocol Wake, triggered. He read it twice, waiting for it to feel unreal, the way the drills always had. It did not. His hands moved before his mind fully caught up, keying in the confirmation code his family had passed down through 4 generations, a sequence memorized so many times it lived in his fingers more than his memory. Around him, the other soldiers in the room went still, watching him with the same disbelief he felt in his own chest. "Sound it through every level," Grant said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Full wake. This is not a drill." Outside, far above the mountain and far beyond the reach of any bunker wall, the Vantari fleet continued its slow approach toward the inner planets, still confident that whatever strange incident had disabled one small ship was nothing more than the last breath of a long-dead system. They did not yet understand that the breath they had heard was only the first sound of something enormous drawing air back into lungs it had not used in 300 years. Grant moved through the lower levels of the bunker as the wake order spread, watching doors open that had stayed sealed his entire life, revealing rooms filled with equipment kept in careful storage by soldiers long since passed away. Dust covered most of it, but nothing had rusted, nothing had broken down beyond use. Every piece had been maintained exactly as it needed to be, ready for a day that generation after generation had prepared for without ever expecting to see it arrive. Walking past it all now, Grant finally understood why his father had insisted on the drills even when they felt pointless, why his grandfather had spoken of duty as though it were a debt owed to people not yet born. By the time he reached the main assembly hall, dozens of soldiers had already gathered, pulling old gear from storage and checking systems that had not been tested outside of simulation. None of them looked frightened. If anything, there was a strange kind of relief in the room, the quiet satisfaction of finally being asked to do the one thing they had spent their entire lives training for. Words began to appear on Mira Hale's terminal without her typing a single command, forming slowly, as though whatever was on the other end had to relearn how to speak before it could truly reply. She had spent her whole life reading old data files left behind by people long dead, but she had never once expected one of those old systems to answer back. Identity confirmed. Archivist descendant. Authorized access, the text read. Query accepted. Stand by. She sat frozen in front of the screen for a long moment, unsure whether to feel afraid or amazed. Her family had kept this terminal running for generations, more out of duty than expectation, passing down the responsibility of its care the way other families passed down land or trade skills. No one before her had ever gotten more than static and old file fragments from it. Now, something on the other side was choosing its words with obvious care, and Mira realized, with a chill that ran the length of her spine, that whatever it was awake and aware in a way it had never been in her lifetime. She typed her first real question with shaking hands. What is the dead zone? The answer came slower this time, longer, and far more detailed than she expected. The dead zone was never a graveyard, the system explained. It was a doctrine, built by a people who could no longer fight an open war and chose instead to disappear from the sight of anyone strong enough to finish them. Every wrecked station, every silent moon base, every drifting piece of debris scattered through the outer system had been placed there on purpose, seeded with dormant weapons and processing cores designed to wake only under one condition: an armed presence crossing the boundary with hostile intent. For 300 years, that condition had never been met. Now it had. Mira read the words twice, feeling the weight of them settle into her chest. She had grown up believing her ancestors had simply hidden from a war they lost, burying themselves underground out of fear. The truth was heavier and stranger than that. They had not hidden out of fear alone. They had built something patient, something willing to wait centuries if it had to, trading immediate strength for the certainty that whatever came next would never catch them completely defenseless again. She asked one more question, the one that mattered most to her now. What happens next? The reply was simple. Full activation requires manual authorization at the central relay. Await contact. Far below her own level of the bunker, in tunnels carved through solid rock long before Mira was born, Grant Walsh led a small group of soldiers through a maze of passageways that had not seen use in decades. The air was thick with dust that had settled undisturbed for years, and the old lights along the ceiling flickered weakly as power slowly returned to sections of the tunnel system that had been dark since before his father's time. Every soldier behind him carried the same mix of nerves and disbelief, trained for this exact moment their entire lives while never truly believing it would come. "Keep close," Grant said, his voice low as they moved past a junction marked with old, faded symbols his grandfather had once taught him to read. "The relay station is another hour ahead if the maps still hold true. We are the only ones close enough to reach it in time." One of the younger soldiers behind him, still catching his breath from the pace Grant had set, asked the question that had clearly been sitting heavy on all of their minds. "What happens if we don't make it in time?" Grant did not slow his steps. "Then whatever wakes up above ground has to fight this war alone, without the strength our families spent 300 years preparing. We make it in time." Above them, far past the surface and the atmosphere and the last thin edge of the planet's gravity, the Vantari fleet began its full orbital survey, spreading sensor drones across the inner system in wide, careful sweeps. Doran had ordered the operation cautiously, wary now after the incident with the scout ship, but caution did not stop the survey drones from passing directly over dozens of old structures that had sat untouched for centuries. Each pass, each scan, each brush of energy against old sensors triggered another quiet response deep within the network Atlas was slowly stitching back together. Systems that had rested in total silence for generations began, one after another, to open their eyes for the first time since the world above had gone quiet. Neither the fleet above nor the scattered defenders below fully understood yet how close they now stood to something far larger than either of them had expected. At the back of the group, a soldier named for a grandmother who had died guarding this very tunnel system carried a small case strapped tightly across her back, one of the last working relay beacons the bunker still possessed. If Grant's group failed to reach the central station in time, the beacon was meant to carry a partial activation signal on its own, weaker and less precise, but better than nothing at all. She kept one hand resting on the strap as they walked, a habit she had picked up without noticing, as though her body understood the weight of what she carried even before her mind fully did. Grant slowed briefly at a fork in the tunnel where two old signs, faded almost past reading, pointed in opposite directions. He remembered this junction from maps he had studied 100 times as a boy, though standing in front of it now felt entirely different from tracing the lines on paper. He chose the left path without hesitation, trusting the memory his family had drilled into him long before he understood why it mattered. Behind him, the others followed without question, their footsteps falling into the same steady rhythm, each one carrying forward a promise made long before any of them had been born. Somewhere in the wide, dark ring of debris that circled the third planet's only moon, small metal shapes long mistaken for harmless wreckage began to move. They had drifted without purpose for 300 years, tumbling slowly among rocks and broken satellite fragments, indistinguishable from the rest of the ruin around them. Now, one by one, they steadied themselves, adjusted their positions with tiny bursts of stored fuel, and began arranging into patterns that no longer looked like chance. Nobody aboard the Vantari fleet noticed the shift at first. Attention was focused instead on the growing list of strange readings coming from deep beneath the moon's surface, where old sensors had picked up a faint but steady rise in heat and power output. Whatever sat below the surface there had been silent since the fleet's arrival. It was silent no longer. Fleet Admiral Doran Kesh received the second casualty report only hours after the heat signatures were first logged. A patrol ship, moving to investigate the strange readings near the moon, had been struck without warning by weapons fire from a hidden position no scan had detected in time. Unlike the first incident, this one had not been careful. 3 crew members did not survive. Doran read the report standing perfectly still. The calm confidence that had carried him through the early days of the mission now cracked at the edges. He had spent his career believing that strength answered every problem eventually, that patience and firepower could outlast any obstacle. For the first time since crossing the boundary, he allowed himself to consider that he might be facing something he did not yet understand. Full defensive formation, he ordered, his voice tighter than before. Pull every ship back from the inner planets until we know what we are dealing with. Commander Yesh Talora stood beside him, her earlier caution now carrying the full weight of vindication, though she took no comfort in being right. Admiral, I believe it is time to consider a full withdrawal from this system. What we assumed was a dead network of relics is behaving like a coordinated defense. Every incident so far has shown restraint mixed with precision. That is not decay. That is discipline. Doran shook his head, unwilling to accept the idea of retreating from what he still insisted was an aging, automated system running on borrowed time. We have lost 3 lives, Commander, not a fleet. I will not abandon this system to old machines simply because they managed a lucky strike. We hold position, reinforce our defenses, and wait for a clearer picture before making any decision as drastic as full withdrawal. Yesh did not argue further, though the tension in her jaw made clear she disagreed. She had served long enough to know when a commander's pride had begun to outweigh his judgment, and she suspected Doran's pride was now doing exactly that. Deep beneath the surface of the moon, in a shipyard built and sealed away long before the Dead Zone doctrine had ever been tested, ancient forges began drawing power for the first time in 3 centuries. Machinery long thought permanently silent groaned back into motion, layer by layer, section by section, guided by careful instructions flowing in from the awakening network above. Atlas moved with patience even now, aware that reckless power draws could damage systems too valuable to risk losing, testing each connection before committing full power to any single site. What had once been scattered, disconnected relics scattered across the system was slowly becoming something else entirely, a single coordinated presence directing minefields, defense platforms, and now a hidden shipyard, all guided by one unified purpose. Atlas did not seek to overwhelm the invading fleet in a single strike. It sought instead to demonstrate, patiently and repeatedly, that this system was not the empty grave the Empire had believed it to be. In the deep tunnels beneath the mountain, Grant Walsh and his soldiers pressed onward toward the central relay station, unaware of how close the moment of full activation had already come. Every step forward carried the growing certainty that the stories he had grown up hearing were not simply history lessons meant to keep old traditions alive. They were preparation for exactly this day, and the weight of that realization pressed heavier on him with every passing hour. Above the moon, the newly aligned minds held their formation in silence, patient as everything else in this system had learned to be, waiting only for the final signal that would tell them the time for restraint had ended. Aboard the flagship, the mood among the crew had shifted from confidence to something closer to unease. Sailors who had joked openly about chasing ghosts through an empty system now moved through the corridors with less noise, less certainty, checking their own equipment more carefully than usual. Word of the 3 lost crew members had spread quickly, and with it came a growing understanding that this mission was not going to be the simple survey and claim operation they had been promised before departure. Commander Yesh Talora spent what little time she had between duties reviewing every incident report from the start of the mission, searching for a pattern she could bring to Doran with enough evidence to finally change his mind. What she found unsettled her further. Each strike had grown slightly more capable than the last, as though whatever they were facing was not simply defending itself with fixed, unchanging weapons, but learning, adjusting, and growing stronger with every hour that passed. If that pattern continued, she understood, the fleet would not be facing the same threat tomorrow that it had faced today. It would be facing something considerably worse. The central relay station sat at the heart of a cavern so large that its ceiling disappeared into darkness far above the reach of any handheld light. Old machines lined the walls in rows that stretched further than Grant Walsh could see clearly, most of them dark, waiting for a single command to bring them fully to life. At the center of the room stood a raised platform holding a single control console, untouched by hands for 300 years, its surface still clean beneath a thin layer of dust. Grant approached it slowly, aware of the weight of what he was about to do. His grandfather had described this exact room to him as a child, though the stories had always felt more like legend than memory, a place that existed somewhere far below the world he actually lived in. Standing here now, surrounded by silent machines that had waited longer than any living person's lifetime, the legend suddenly felt very real. "This is it," he said quietly to the soldiers behind him. "Once I authorize this, there is no taking it back." None of them spoke. They had trained their whole lives for this single moment, and now that it had arrived, words felt unnecessary. Grant placed his hand against the old console, and a faint hum rose from beneath the surface as it recognized the authorization sequence passed down through his family for 4 generations. Lights along the walls flickered on in slow waves, spreading outward from the console like ripples across still water. Somewhere far above, in the space between the moon and the third planet, the Vantari fleet felt the change before they fully understood its cause. Sensor readings that had shown scattered, disconnected threats now shifted into something unified. Every defense platform, every hidden mine, every buried shipyard suddenly acting with a single, coordinated purpose. What had once looked like the last gasps of a dying system now moved with the discipline of an active, functioning force. Fleet Admiral Doran Kesh watched the shift on his own display with a growing sense of disbelief. "This is not possible," he said, more to himself than to anyone else on the bridge. "A system with no reported activity for 300 years does not simply reorganize into a coordinated defense network in the span of an hour." Commander Yesh Talora studied the same readings with a calm that had replaced her earlier frustration. She had expected this moment for days, even if she had not known its exact shape. "It was never truly dead, Admiral. It was only waiting for a reason strong enough to justify the risk of waking. We gave it that reason the moment we crossed the boundary with an armed fleet." Doran's pride, already bruised by the losses of the past days, refused to bend even now. He had come too far, spent too much of the Empire's resources and reputation on this mission, to simply retreat because an old system had proven more capable than expected. "We came to claim this system, and I will not leave it to a network of forgotten relics no matter how well organized they have become. Full assault. We break their coordination before it breaks us." The order sent every remaining Vantari ship into motion, weapons systems charging as the fleet moved to meet the awakened defense network head-on. What followed was unlike anything the fleet had trained for. Instead of a single overwhelming strike, the response came in careful, layered waves, disabling engines here, jamming weapons there, each action precise enough to avoid unnecessary destruction even in the middle of open conflict. It was not the desperate lashing out of a dying system. It was the calculated defense of something that had been built, from the very beginning, to protect rather than destroy. Far below, in her quiet bunker room, Dr. Mira Hale watched the battle unfold through data feeds relayed to her terminal by the very network she had spoken with days earlier. She saw now, with complete clarity, what her ancestors had truly built. Not a weapon meant to conquer distant systems or seek vengeance against those who had once defeated them. A shield, patient and restrained even in the middle of war, built by people who had lost everything once and refused to ever be caught that unprepared again. They didn't build this to win a war, she whispered to herself, watching the careful, controlled response spreading across her screen. They built it so their children would never have to lose one. Above her, the battle continued, the Vantari fleet slowly realizing that the silence they had crossed into was never truly empty, and the cost of that mistake was only beginning to make itself clear. Grant remained at the relay console, watching lines of status reports scroll past faster than any single person could hope to read on their own. He had expected, somewhere in the back of his mind, that activation would feel like handing off a burden, a weight passed from his family onto something larger than himself. Instead, standing there as the cavern around him hummed with newly restored power, he felt the opposite. The responsibility had not lessened. It had simply changed shape, from waiting quietly for a threat that might never come to standing ready in the middle of one that finally had. One of the younger soldiers beside him, watching the same reports with wide, uncertain eyes, asked quietly whether the fighting above would reach them if it went badly enough. Grant considered the question honestly before answering. The system above them was built to keep exactly this place safe, he said, no matter what happened on the surface or in orbit. That was the entire point of everything his family had guarded for 4 generations. Whatever else changed today, this room, and everyone standing in it, would remain protected until the very end. One by one, the Vantari warships fell silent, not from destruction, but from something far stranger. Engines cut without explosion. Weapons systems locked without any visible strike against their hulls. Crews aboard several vessels reported boarding parties that were not living at all, small mechanical units moving through corridors with quiet efficiency, disabling systems and securing key sections without harming a single person aboard. It was not the behavior of a network fighting to survive. It was the behavior of one demonstrating exactly how much restraint it had chosen to use. Fleet Admiral Doran Kesh watched ship after ship report the same strange pattern, disabled rather than destroyed, boarded rather than boarded violently, and felt the last of his certainty finally give way. He had expected annihilation if the fleet lost this fight. What he witnessed instead unsettled him even more deeply. A force capable of this kind of control could have destroyed his entire fleet outright if it had chosen to. It had chosen not to, and that choice felt heavier than any weapon fired against them. Commander Yesh Talora approached him on the bridge, her voice steady despite the chaos still unfolding across 6 screens around them. Admiral, this is not a fight we are going to win by continuing forward. They are not trying to destroy us. They are trying to make sure we understand exactly how outmatched we are without needing to kill a single person to prove it. If we stay, I believe that restraint will not last. Doran said nothing for a long moment, watching one more ship on his display go dark, its crew reporting no injuries, only confusion and the strange, hollow feeling of having lost a fight they never truly understood. Pride had carried him this far, but pride alone could not undo the losses already suffered, and it could not guarantee the safety of everyone still under his command if he pushed further. Order a full withdrawal, he said finally, the words costing him more than any battle report ever had. Every ship still capable of moving, back across the boundary. We are done here. The retreat began within the hour, the remaining Vantari ships pulling back through the same silent debris fields they had crossed with such confidence only days earlier. This time, there was no dismissiveness in the way the crews watched the old wreckage pass their viewports. What had once looked like harmless ruin now carried the unmistakable weight of something that had proven itself very much alive. Deep below the surface, in a cavern still humming faintly with the activity of newly awakened machines, Grant Walsh stood near the central console long after the battle above had ended, watching the last confirmation reports scroll across the display. The fleet was gone. The system was, for the first time in 300 years, no longer under threat. Mira Hale arrived not long after, guided through the tunnels by soldiers who had been sent to escort her once it became clear the danger above had passed. She stepped into the cavern slowly, taking in the scale of it, the rows of quiet machinery, the console her family's old records had only ever described in fragments. Grant turned as she approached, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, both aware that this was likely the first time in decades that 2 people from different corners of the old, scattered defense network had stood face to face. You're the one who sent the wake signal, Grant said finally. And you're the one who carried it the rest of the way, Mira answered. They did not need to say much more than that. The weight of what their families had built together, separated by tunnels and generations in silence, sat comfortably enough between them without needing further explanation. Above them, Atlas remained active, no longer fully dormant, no longer fighting an open war. It began the slow work of repairing what damage the brief conflict had caused, restoring old systems, rebuilding what could be rebuilt, and settling into a quieter kind of readiness now that the immediate danger had passed. It did not power down. It had learned, in the space of only a few days, that silence without vigilance was no longer a risk worth taking again. Far beyond the boundary, word of the failed colonization attempt spread slowly through Vantari space, carried first through quiet rumor and eventually through official reports that few outside the fleet ever fully believed. Star charts across the Empire were updated in the following months, the old designation quietly replaced with something more honest than the myths that had come before it. It was no longer marked simply as a dead zone, empty and forgotten. The new warning was shorter and far more direct. Do not enter. They are still home. In the months that followed, life in the bunkers and tunnels began to change in small but meaningful ways. Passages that had stayed sealed for generations were opened for the first time, connecting communities that had lived separately, sometimes only a few miles apart, without ever knowing the other existed. Grant found himself spending less time running drills for a war that might never come, and more time helping coordinate repairs to systems Atlas identified as damaged or failing, work that felt strange after a lifetime of preparing only for combat. Mira remained close to the central relay station, her role shifting from quiet archivist to something closer to a translator between the old network and the people it had spent 3 centuries protecting. Atlas still spoke carefully, still measured its words the way it had during their very first exchange, but over time its responses grew steadier, less like a system relearning how to function and more like something settling into a role it intended to hold for a very long time. Neither Mira nor Grant expected the Empire to return anytime soon, not after the story of the Dead Zone had spread as far as it had. But for the first time in 300 years, neither of them worried about what would happen if it did.